Man insults Keanu Reeves on a first-class flight, instantly regrets it when the truth is revealed. The luxury cabin of the first-class section buzzed with quiet conversation as passengers settled into their wide leather seats. The scent of fresh espresso and warm hand towels filled the air, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and comfort. Among the travelers was Jonathan Whitmore, a high-powered investment banker who prided himself on his sharp suits, expensive tastes, and a net worth that made him feel untouchable. Jonathan had always considered first class his domain. It was a space reserved for people like him, successful, elite, and wealthy beyond measure. So when he noticed the man seated next to him, his brow furrowed in immediate disapproval. The man wore a plain black hoodie, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his posture was relaxed, almost too casual for someone who should appreciate the luxury of first class. Jonathan's lips curled in distaste. He had seen this type before, some lucky lottery winner or a social media influencer who had no real understanding of what it meant to earn success. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, Jonathan leaned slightly toward the man, unable to contain his irritation. "You know, they really should enforce a dress code in first class," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with condescension. "There's a certain level of sophistication expected here." The man turned his head slightly and regarded Jonathan with an unreadable expression. He didn't seem offended, just mildly amused. "Oh, I didn't realize clothes determined how much someone paid for their ticket." Jonathan smirked. "Well, they don't. But they do determine how much respect you command. First impressions matter, you know." The man chuckled lightly and shrugged. "Fair enough." Jonathan assumed that would be the end of it, but something about the man's calm demeanor irked him. He expected pushback, an argument, maybe even a flustered apology. Instead, the guy just sat there, unbothered. "Let me guess," Jonathan pressed, unable to resist. "Influencer? Crypto bro? Maybe a trust fund kid slumming it for the aesthetic?" The man just smiled and shook his head. "Nope, none of those." "Then what do you do?" Jonathan asked, now genuinely curious. Before the man could respond, a flight attendant appeared beside them, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mr. Reeves," she exclaimed, her voice filled with warmth and excitement. "It's such an honor to have you on board again. Would you like your usual drink before takeoff?" Jonathan's stomach dropped. He turned to face the man beside him, really looking at him this time. The familiar features, the kind eyes, the subtle yet unmistakable presence. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. The same man whose movies had grossed billions worldwide. The same man known for his generosity, humility, and kindness. The same man Jonathan had just insulted without a second thought. Keanu gave the flight attendant a polite nod. "Just some water, please. Thank you." As she walked away, Jonathan felt his face heat with embarrassment. He had spent the last 5 minutes treating one of Hollywood's most beloved actors like some clueless nobody. I had no idea." Jonathan stammered, suddenly feeling like an absolute fool. "I didn't recognize you." Keanu simply smiled. "It's okay. Happens all the time." But it wasn't okay. Not to Jonathan. His entire philosophy revolved around status, image, and superiority. And yet, sitting beside him was a man who had achieved more than he ever could, who had the kind of wealth and fame that Jonathan could only dream of. And he didn't act like it mattered. For the first time in years, Jonathan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. As the plane took off, he sat in silence, humbled by a lesson he never saw coming. The flight settled into a smooth cruise above the clouds, and the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sneaking glances at Keanu Reeves, who sat beside him sipping his water, completely unbothered. Jonathan's mind raced. He had built his entire career on the idea that success meant power, status. That a person's worth was measured by their wealth, by how they looked, by the way they carried themselves. And yet, here was a man who had everything, money, fame, admiration, didn't feel the need to flaunt any of it. He cleared his throat. "Look, Mr. Reeves," he hesitated, feeling oddly nervous. "I want to apologize for what I said earlier. I made a judgment without knowing anything about you." Keanu looked at him, his expression kind but unreadable. Apology accepted. Jonathan expected that to be the end of it. A polite nod, maybe a smile, and then silence for the rest of the flight. But Keanu didn't look away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "Can I ask you something?" Jonathan swallowed. Sure. Why did it bother you so much?" "What?" Keanu gestured casually. "The way I dressed. The way I looked. You seemed irritated the moment you saw me. Why?" Jonathan felt a strange sense of vulnerability creeping in. He had never been asked a question like that before. People either agreed with him or ignored him. No one had ever challenged him to reflect on his own behavior. "I guess." He hesitated, then sighed. "I've spent my whole life working to be where I am. I built my wealth from the ground up, and I learned that appearances matter. People judge you based on how you present yourself. First class is full of CEOs, executives, people at the top of their industries. When I saw you, I just assumed you didn't belong." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, not offended, just listening. "And now?" Jonathan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Now I feel like an idiot." Keanu chuckled softly. "You're not an idiot, you just learned something new." Jonathan stared at him. "That's it? You're not going to lecture me?" Keanu shrugged. "What would be the point? You already understand what went wrong, and if you're thinking about it, that means you have a chance to change." Jonathan sat back, running a hand through his hair. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. People either tried to impress him, flatter him, or compete with him. But Keanu Reeves? He had nothing to prove. For the rest of the flight, Jonathan found himself in deep thought. He didn't talk much, and neither did Keanu. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was reflective. As they landed in New York, Jonathan stood up, gathering his things. Before stepping into the aisle, he turned to Keanu. "Hey, thanks." Keanu smiled. "Safe travels, man." Jonathan walked off the plane feeling different. He had spent years thinking that money defined a person's worth. But now he realized that true worth had nothing to do with wealth. It was about how you treated people. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Whitmore wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been chasing the wrong thing all along.